Welcome back to the AI Policy Podcast. In this episode, with my colleague Gregory C. Allen, we will discuss the Trump administration's vision for tech policy, export controls on the Nvidia H20, and Huawei's response. Greg, welcome. I want to start with OSTP Director Michael Kratsios' speech on technology policy. On April 14th, Director of White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, Michael Kratsios gave a landmark speech outlining the Trump administration's technology policy priorities. This was his first public address since his Senate confirmation in March. Can you give me a sense of what the vision he articulated for American technology leadership is?
Sure, and let me just start by saying I've known Mike Kratsios since, gosh, maybe 2018. He was the senior-most official for most of the first Trump administration in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and he's one of those folks who came out of the first administration with a really good reputation on a bipartisan basis, respected on both sides. So I think a lot of people were reassured to see him come in the seat. Maybe would have even been happier if his confirmation process would have been sped up, but now he's in the seat. He has articulated, what the vision of his White House Office of Science and Technology Policy is going to be, and therefore, what the vision of the Trump White House as a whole for science and technology policy is going to be. And I think there was a bunch of interesting stuff in this speech, which is worth going into.
Closely followed speech, very closely followed, line by line even.
Yeah, and more so than you would normally see for out of OSTP, which traditionally is for like nerds and wonks such as myself. But there was a couple things he did in sort of the big overall setup that I thought were interesting. The first of which is it's very traditional in all kinds of policy jobs and political jobs to kind of bash your predecessor and say, oh, everything they did was bad and we're going to be so much better. But Kratsios is his sort of thing is not really attacking Biden, although he does do that at various points in the speech. But he's sort of saying, like, the past 30 years, something has gone wrong in the way that America relates to technology. So he has this quote, which I think is worth quoting at length. There's a lot of quotable stuff in this speech, which if folks haven't read it, I do recommend reading it. But here's what he said. Over the past 30 years, only 3 commercial nuclear reactors have been built and 10 have been closed. Despite spending almost twice as much on healthcare as peer nations, we have the lowest life expectancy. Apollo 17's steps on the lunar surface have proved mankind's last. The X-15's record still stands, and the Concorde was decommissioned more than 2 decades ago. Our passenger planes are slower than they used to be. Our trains crawl compared to those in other parts of the world. Our cars do not fly. Advances have not stopped, but something has gone wrong. So he's basically saying, look, it's not that, America doesn't have a great innovation base, but we're used to there was this time in the 20th century and for a good part of the 21st century where technology was advancing in all fronts. And now what you really have is sort of these islands of still exciting technical innovation in places like digital tech, in places like biotech, but there's not that sort of broad brush advancing on all fronts thing. And he's saying something has gone wrong and my administration wants to improve that. So what are they going to do? Well, he announces a 3-pillar strategy, using simple words. We have to make smart choices about where we're putting our R&D dollars. We have to make the right choices in a pro-innovation regulatory regime. And then we have to make the easy choice to adopt the incredible products and tools made by the American builders and enable their export abroad. And I think of those, that third one of making the easy choice to adopt products is in some ways the most interesting one. That's going to come up again later in this conversation. But overall, what he is promising, folks, if we move forward, if we implement this vision, we're going to get to something he calls, quote, the golden age of American innovation is on our horizon if we choose it. And then he goes on to say, the choice of individuals to master the sclerosis of the state, the choice of individuals to craft new technologies and give themselves to scientific discoveries that will bend time and space, make more with less, and drive us further into the endless frontier. So he's with that endless frontier remark, he's hearkening back to the vision of Vannevar Bush in the post-World War II era, which gave birth to what ultimately became, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and this sort of enduring U.S. government involvement in science and technology innovation. So he's saying something has gone wrong over the past 30 years. We have a strategy to get rid of it, to fix it. And if we do that, the vision is of a golden age of American innovation and a broadly based American innovation where we're making progress on all fronts, not just on internet tech.
And do you think this golden age is actually possible given all the constraints we're dealing with right now?
So I think that this is kind of interesting, and you're seeing these sorts of points being made more and more on a bipartisan basis. I think probably a lot of the listeners in our audience are familiar with the book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson called Abundance, which is a left-wing criticism of the left wing and what it's done to make stuff hard. I mean, they're calling for a deregulatory agenda in science and innovation, but they're making that criticism from the left. The right is making a very similar criticism. So you can sort of think of it as if you're trying to water your garden, right? And you have a kink in the hose. Well, there's two things that you can try and do. One is you can really crank up the water pressure. That's like akin to throwing a lot more money at it, throwing a lot more people at it. Or you can try and get rid of the kink in the hose, which is trying to remove the barriers to innovation. So I think what's interesting is that more and more, both the left and the right are interested in what makes life hard if you are a research scientist at a university? What makes life hard if you are a company trying to commercialize a new technology? Can we go identify those blockers, those kinks that these individuals are encountering? And can we get them out of the way? Like, can we figure out, like, why we cannot build high-speed rail in this country and our trains run faster than, not just places like, China, which is a build, kind of a infrastructure country, but slower than Spain, slower than France, slower than countries that also have a reputation for being sclerotic in a lot of things. So I think the focus on identifying those blockers is really noteworthy. And that if you can do it in the right way, yes, there is a lot of progress to be unlocked.
And Greg, what about Kratsios' vision for federal funding on these in terms of driving innovation?
Yeah, and here I think you see sort of two echoes with his earlier points, which makes sense. So the first thing he emphasizes is creativity. Like, we are used to a federal funding model, which is like the National Science Foundation does a massive call for proposals, and then there's expert panels that review those proposals, and then they give them out to the proposals that are hopefully the best, but certainly like the best according to a certain familiar evaluation protocol. And what Kratsios is saying is like, hey, there's a lot of other ways to deploy our money. And in many circumstances, we could probably get a higher return on investment, higher innovation return on investment if we use things like prizes, right? Like anybody who invents X is going to get, $10 million, or advanced market commitments, which we saw being deployed in Operation Warp Speed to develop the COVID vaccine, which is basically anybody who invents the COVID vaccine and it, gets through FDA approval, we promise to buy, such and such hundreds of millions of doses of that vaccine. So those kinds of, that's the same amount of money being deployed, but the amount of innovation that you get can go up. And so that's the first thing he's emphasizing is creativity in the way that we spend those dollars. And then the second thing is targeting that at, adoption potential, because there's, a real emphasis in American culture on who invents the technology. But when you're thinking certainly in terms of like geopolitical competition, that's not always the most important nexus of the activity. Like, think about, for example, this is a point that Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson make in their book. Thomas Edison was not the guy who invented the light bulb. He wasn't even the guy who invented the incandescent light bulb. He was the guy who figured out how to make it mass adoption compatible. He solved the million little challenges between, generating electric light and putting electric lights in homes all across America. He figured out the mass adoption potential of it. And we've seen a phenomenon where really cool battery technology is invented by American scientists, and then companies like Cattle of China are the ones who end up making all the money based off those innovative technologies. Or similarly, in like display technology, there was a Korean firm that had a bunch of innovations, and that firm ended up moving to China after an acquisition. And a lot of the money being made, a lot of the scale out, the mass adoption of these innovative technologies ends up moving somewhere else. So what's interesting here is that they're not just focused on, innovation, who makes the breakthrough. They're also interested in innovation, who scales the mass adoption of the breakthrough, who generates the greatest economic returns from the breakthrough. And that, I think, is a really interesting change in emphasis coming out of a place like the White House Office of Science and Technology.
So if I understand this right, they're trying to not only incentivize, high-tech research innovation, but they're also trying to incentivize us being able to scale it here ourselves.
Right. And so getting it ready for massive commercial scale in terms of production and getting it ready for massive scale adoption, whether that's by enterprises or consumers.
Okay. Speaking of China, we can't talk about this issue without talking about China. I want to talk about the Trump administration controls on the H20. On April 9th, the Trump administration informed Nvidia that their H20 chip would require a license to export to China. The last time we were on this podcast, there was reporting that the administration might not choose to control the H20 following a meeting between Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang and President Trump. What changed?
Well, I think we can connect this to Kratsios' speech because he was explicitly critical of the Biden administration's, quote, small yard, high fence export control strategy. I mean, he literally said, quote, as the failure of the Biden administration's small yard, high fence approach makes clear, it is not enough to seek to protect America's technological lead. We also have a duty to promote American technological leadership. Now, he still came out supportive of the export controls, but the way that he was supporting those export controls was really about stopping China. I think he was, saying we need to keep our technology out of our competitors' hands. That's consistent with some other stuff that has come out of various Trump administration officials. And even after the reporting that the Trump administration was wavering on the idea of blocking exports of the H20 chip, Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang very famously met with Trump at Mar-a-Lago. And after that, there were some news outlets who were saying, oh, maybe Donald Trump has decided that the H20 ban, which had been promoted by right-wing think tanks, had been promoted by people who went on to, now have a job in the Trump administration. Instead, they did, in fact, send NVIDIA a letter, and we learned about this because NVIDIA had to declare it to their investors in their SEC filing, that they, in fact, are not going to be allowed to export the H20 chips to China. So this is the degraded chip that is special made for the Chinese market, special made to comply with export control regulations. Many folks, including, Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei and others, had basically said, look, this chip is still too good. China's going to be able to do a lot of things that we don't want them to be able to do if you sell these chips. And what's interesting is in almost all the previous export control packages, NVIDIA told their investors, this is not going to hurt our revenue. We are supply constrained. We are not demand constrained. But this time, they said they're going to take $5.5 billion worth of charges. But here's what they said in their filings, quote, associated with H20 products for inventory, purchase commitments, and related services. And what that basically means is that they had stuff in the factory pipeline that was, at various stages of production. Maybe it was 1% made, maybe it was 99% made. But the point is that those were units that they thought they were going to sell to China. They're not going to be able to sell them. And outside of China, there's not much of a market for the H20 because you'd much rather buy NVIDIA Blackwells. You'd much rather buy NVIDIA H100s. So the point here being that NVIDIA is going to be able to ask TSMC, hey, that production line that you had making H20s, we aren't going to want to make H20s anymore. Please reallocate that capacity to H100s or whatever the case may be. But for all of that stuff, that product that was stuck in the pipeline at the moment they announced the export controls, that is now lost revenue. And I think that gets to the challenge of like the uncertainty of all of this. Nvidia made a bet when they went to TSMC and said, start the engines, start the robots, start making all these H20 chips. That's a very expensive decision. And they made that because they thought that they had successfully persuaded the Trump administration, or would be able to successfully persuade the Trump administration, to not enact this policy of blocking H20 exports. But when it finally comes down, now they're stuck, with that $5.5 billion charge. And it's not just them. AMD, Intel, others, they had chips that they were hoping to export to China that they're not going to be able to sell anymore.
And it's not so easy to flip the switch on and off either.
No, Jensen Huang has said this on the record. When they, make a decision to partner with TSMC on making, a various chip or whatever have you, just the decision to start the process of tape out, I think it is like $100 million email to send, like, we want to, begin proceeding. And then once you actually have all these wafers that have begun production, that's very expensive. According to reporting by the New York Times, this crackdown came after Nvidia. This crackdown on Nvidia's H20 chip came after the White House and Commerce Department received briefings on the ties between DeepSeek, China's leading AI model developer at this stage, and Chinese military institutions. So a lot of the people who work at DeepSeek, according to this analysis, have ties to universities like the National University of Defense Technology. Other kinds of equivalent military affiliated or military tied Chinese universities are now working at DeepSeek. Some of them have military records. These kinds of things sort of moved the needle of, like, who exactly are we helping over there in China? Are we helping some kind of like harmless advocates of open source, or are we helping folks who really do have ties to the Chinese national security establishment? Those kinds of concerns, at least according to the reporting in the Times, sort of tipped the needle in the internal debate.
So, Greg, how do these controls impact the business prospects of leading U.S. AI and semiconductor firms?
So I think there's a short-term impact, there's a mid-term impact, and then there's a long-term impact. The short-term, Nvidia stock is down 8.4%. So if you actually look at the beginning of this year, calendar 2025, I think Nvidia is down something like 30%. It's been a pretty rough, 4.5 months here for Nvidia, between, what happened in DeepSeek, between what's happening in the wider stock market associated, with Trump tariff decisions and other kinds of, policy debates, and now this H20 ban. They have a tough thing. Now, the most short-term impact is just that product that was in the manufacturing process that's not going to be shipped to China. In the midterm, I think things are okay, because ultimately, just in America, Europe, Japan, the Middle East, etc., there is demand for all the chips that Nvidia and TSMC can manufacture. So, like, they're still going to be able to sell all the chips that they want to make. I think a lot of that H20 manufacturing capacity can ultimately be repurposed for other kinds of chips for which there are, hungry customers. Then there's the long-term impact, which really gets to, okay, I think China understands, they've understood for a long time now, that they have to think about an AI ecosystem that exists, without Western AI chips. And that, I think, is probably what concerns Nvidia the most, probably more than the short-term implications.
Some experts are saying that the U.S. ability to sell semiconductors in China is gone. It's over. And along those lines, just one day after the H20 controls went into place, Huawei unveiled its own next generation AI chip, the Ascend 920. What do we know about this chip so far?
Yeah, so as I testified before Congress just a couple of weeks ago, Huawei is the most credible competitor to Nvidia in China. Huawei actually had been making AI chips since 2019. They had been hoping to challenge Nvidia in that time frame, but the export controls of 2019 and, more importantly, 2020 kind of tamped back Huawei's AI chip ambitions for quite some while. But now Huawei is here again, and they have, a more credible series of products. The 920, I think it's worth emphasizing, this is the next generation chip for Huawei. So really the chips that we're encountering in the Chinese market right now are Ascend 910Bs and to a lesser extent Ascend 910Cs, which is basically just two 910B dies co-located on the same integrated chip with advanced packaging technologies. This 920 is their next generation chip, and they're emphasizing, at least according to Huawei reporting, really pretty good performance, especially in memory bandwidth, 4 terabytes per second. That's the same amount of memory bandwidth, if I'm not mistaken here, as the H20 chip is supposed to be providing. So that, in that regard, you've got a Huawei chip that at least they can make a prototype of with decent performance. Now, they're saying this is going to be on the 6-nanometer manufacturing node, or at least equivalent to 6-nanometer node. So that's quite a bit behind, what NVIDIA is able to access with TSMC. So these chips are going to be nowhere near as good as NVIDIA Blackwell chips. But the question is, how competitive are they going to be in terms of Chinese customers' other options? So their other options are going to be whatever the successor to the H20 is going to be. So what's the chip that the U.S. government will allow NVIDIA to sell? And then the other question is going to be smuggling. How much smuggling can take place to get NVIDIA Blackwell chips into China, for use in training advanced AI models, because all of those smuggling sales, those are sales that, Huawei is not getting access to. And I think this 920 chip could have decent, I mean, not good, not competitive with NVIDIA, but decent performance. The challenge for them is how many can they actually manufacture, right? The 6-nanometer line at SMIC is not up and running right now. They still have to prove it out. Everything that I've heard is that the yields in this performance are terrible. So according to their press release, they're hoping to hit mass manufacturing in the second half of 2025. I think that's an incredibly ambitious target. I would be very surprised if they hit that. And I think it's kind of noteworthy that Huawei releases this press release, the day after the H20 news. I think they're trying to signal to their customers, hey, give up on NVIDIA, bet on Huawei. We've got something pretty good coming down the pike. We want you to be our partner going forward.
As you know, Greg, and many experts know, that historically there's been a performance gap between Huawei chips and Western alternatives. Are they closing that gap?
So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say no. Because basically what we know right now is, according to reporting about DeepSeek's analysis of can we use NVIDIA chips, can we use, Huawei's chips as substitutes for NVIDIA's chips, those Ascend 910Cs, which are a thing you can actually go out and buy right now, they're only about 60% as good as NVIDIA chips on the hardware side of the equation. So Huawei's next generation chip, this 920, it's going to be better than only as good, 60% as good as an H100 chip, right? So Huawei's current generation is only 60% as good as what is, at this stage, NVIDIA's last generation. I think the performance jump between an H100 and a Blackwell, B100 or B200, I think that's going to be a greater performance jump than Huawei is about to make between their Ascend 910C and the Ascend 920. So I think the hardware gap between these companies is actually probably growing. But again, what Huawei cares most about is what is the gap in performance between our product in China and NVIDIA's product in China. And NVIDIA only sells their degraded products in China. There's a second part of the story here, which is the overall software ecosystem surrounding these chips. NVIDIA's chips are really good on the hardware design angle, but so are AMD's chips. They're also very good. But NVIDIA dominates this market because their software stack is so much superior to what AMD is able to bring to bear in the AI market. So I think the hardware gap between NVIDIA and Huawei is probably going to grow. I think the software gap might be the more important one that has a real opportunity to shrink if Huawei can generate a bunch of enthusiasm behind these chips and behind the CAN software ecosystem that they have that competes with Nvidia CUDA. That's the thing that probably matters more to Chinese AI developers who are asking themselves, should we bet our company on Huawei against, Nvidia, what we can still gain access to, whether that's by smuggling or whether that's from legitimate sales that the U.S. government approves.
Greg, how would you characterize the overall health of China's AI ecosystem?
So I would say right now, China's AI ecosystem is still coming through with all the chips that they've been able to acquire, since the Biden administration enacted these export controls in October of 2022. That includes a heck of a lot of H100 chips that were sold, H800 chips that were sold during the 12 months where that was legal, and a heck of a lot of these H20 chips that have been sold in the, year and a half period where that was legal. And that is enough to accomplish an awful lot. DeepSeek adoption is going gangbusters right now because the model doesn't have especially intensive compute requirements, and because you're seeing directives come out of the Chinese government that basically says, hey, every single state-owned enterprise, which is an awful lot of China's quote-unquote private sector, is actually ultimately owned by, the Chinese government. They're being directed to find ways to accelerate their adoption of AI, and they're working really hard, to try and integrate that. So I think, again, coming back to what Kratsios said, right, is you're fighting one battle on innovation and you're fighting a totally separate battle on adoption. And China, I think in their AI ecosystem, they're trying to move out more aggressively on adoption and saying maybe that is the battlefield that will even matter most.
Greg, finally, earlier this month, Huawei released its Pangu Ultra model. What kind of chips was it trained on? And again, what does this model indicate about the health of China's AI ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the emphasis has been out there about, the DeepSeek AI model, and Huawei, of course, was trying to, get this a partnership going between itself and DeepSeek. But as a lot of folks who have had business experience in China will note, Huawei is not always the best business partner because they're very, very likely to launch a competitor to whatever product they were partnering with you on. And here now we have, right, Huawei launching its own AI model. I don't think the model is especially noteworthy in terms of performance. It's not like leading anything in benchmarks. I think it's not even as good as what DeepSeek had already accomplished in almost all cases. But there is something noteworthy about this model, which is Huawei claims that it was trained on 8,192 Ascend chips. So they're basically saying, this is the kind of model you can get when you train on our chips. Number one, you can train models on our chips. That is a viable thing. We just proved that you can do it because we just did it. The second thing is, one of the greatest performance limitations of Huawei chips compared to Nvidia chips is how many of these chips can you connect together and have them act as a team where the whole is more than the sum of the parts. In Nvidia's case, you've got stuff like the Colossus supercluster that xAI runs out of Memphis. That's 200,000 Nvidia chips working together, which from a programmer standpoint is almost just like acting with one chip. I mean, they're that good as working at a team. Some of the previous analysis that I had seen basically said that Huawei Ascend chips really struggle to connect together and to work effectively higher than clusters of only 2,000 chips. So literally 100-fold worse than Nvidia in working as a team. They're saying they trained this on 8,192 chips, which is the highest number I've seen yet. Still, massively below what Nvidia can do, but also a sign that they're making progress on this critical area of performance of the chips that a lot of developers are going to care about. So I think Pangu is less interesting in terms of the actual performance of that model itself, and more about what it says that Huawei is trying to message to the overall Chinese AI ecosystem.
Greg, as always, thanks. We'll be back in a week or so with our next episode. Stay
Talking with you, Andrew, as always. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. If you like what you heard, there's an easy way for you to help us. Please give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform and subscribe. And tell your friends. It really helps spread the word. This podcast was produced by Sarah Baker, Isaac Goldston, and Sadie McCullough. See you next time.